But what I really wanted to focus on is answering a few questions about when should you irrigate, and maybe are you irrigating correctly? And if not, what are some changes that we can make? And this was originally put together by Dr. Bill Fountain, who's retired. He's from the UK Department of Horticulture. I've made a lot. I've kind of almost changed it completely, but I still gave him a little bit of credit here for originally putting this together. So let's just jump in and see if this is the right button to push. You should be seeing that one. Okay, so just to begin with, we're talking mostly here on irrigation, we're talking about watering, right? And that is the single most important factor for not just, I mean, you can look at it on a broad scale here about continuation of life on Earth, but we're talking about our plant material today. And so for trees and shrubs, we get this call pretty frequently. Do I need to be fertilizing? Do I need to be spraying for every little pest that I see or every little leaf spot that shows up on my plant? And really and truly, the one thing that we can do that makes the most impact is providing water and doing it in the correct way. Otherwise, we can make things worse too. So we want to narrow in on that today. And the question that kind of revolves around watering is, when do I need to water my trees? So I made a quick list here. And I just want to briefly kind of give you a definition for each of these and how they may apply in your landscape or how they may apply across the state. We are pretty fortunate here in Kentucky. We get about, on average, 50 inches of rain a year. And so that measures out to about an inch a week. Now, it doesn't always come 1 inch per week. If it did, that would be downright perfect. If we had it that way, our plants would never be drought stressed, and the plants would just do great. But it kind of doesn't come that way. As Sharon was saying just before we started, sometimes we'll get 3 inches in a day, and then we won't get anything for 15 days after that. And that's kind of normal. But there's a lot of variability in rainfall, even within close sites. And I know you've experienced this too, where you might, let's say you have a day job and you're at work and it's pouring down rain, and then you go home thinking, ooh, I don't have to water anything. All my plants are fine. The garden's fine. Everything's great. Hadn't rained a drop at the house. And it may not be 10 miles away from your home. And so there's a lot of variability in that. And the reason for that being tied into when do I need to water my trees is that we can't just base it on whatever the forecast is for the day. There's a little bit more to it. And maybe you have your own home, not water meters, but rain gauges and those types of things to keep track of how much rainfall you're getting. If you don't, that would probably be a good first step to make sure that you're measuring how much rainfall you get, because sometimes you can get a little bit and assume that you got a lot during that day. Okay, so variability, that's one. That plays into the decision on whether or not you need to water your trees. Number two is infiltration. And so in our area, what we're referring to basically is out of these three that are listed, soil compaction makes probably the largest impact. And because we tend to have across Kentucky a very clay-based soil, compaction is pretty common. And if you have kids out in the yard, or heaven forbid, you park your vehicle in your grass around trees or under trees or during construction or those types of things, soils can get very compacted very quickly. And so that's going to impact how well the water infiltrates into the soil. And so one tree on your property may be doing fine because there's no compaction there, where another may be suffering, and it may just be the compaction. And that's noticed because of crusting of the soil. If it's just bare soil exposed, you can notice it's crusting over during dry periods, but also vegetation. And so trees and lawn have a little bit more need for water than trees that are in a flower bed that have mulch, for example, around them. And of course, the reason for that is competition. And your grass is going to absorb a lot of that moisture before it ever filtrates through and gets to the root zone of those trees. And so that's another factor that plays into this question, is when do I need to water my trees? So variability, it may not always be raining equally across your county or your area. Infiltration. Number three is percolation. This is a tough one to kind of get our mind wrapped around. We tend to say, well, we got good drainage. The soil drains very well on our property, but that may just be surface drainage. What about internal drainage? and I'm saying drainage as like we want the water to move away. And sometimes we do. Sometimes waters, especially very heavy clay soils, will hold too much water and it won't percolate and it will sit and it'll be really wet soils, but it will not become available to the plant very readily. And so there could be a really wet site, but the roots aren't able to take that water up because it's bound to those particles in the soil, the clay particles in the soil. In other parts of the US, I don't know that there's many areas in Kentucky that are like this. There may be a lot of sandy type soils. And so, of course, that's going to be the opposite effect here. Percolation is too high. And so water's coming in, it's draining right through. And even though we got a good rain event, the soils are staying too dry, right? So percolation can be a factor on your site as well. Water holding capacity of the soil, kind of related to percolation. Again, how much organic matter soil, we've said it again, how much organic matter is in your soil greatly impacts the water holding capacity. So in new home construction, for example, what's the first thing that happens? We take the topsoil, we don't, but the builder takes the topsoil and they rake it all off to get down to a nice solid base to build a house on. And then maybe they put a little bit of it back, or maybe they don't. Here at our office, for example, I'm pretty sure, based on the number of trees that I've planted around here, that all the good soil is that way, and this is all the subsoil because it's not very good. And so there's no organic matter in it. It's not even, if you've ever seen those charts of the soil horizons, it's not near the top. It's down in these lower horizons. And so the water holding capacity is awful. It's just hard. It crusts a lot, and water can't be held because there's no organic matter in there. So that's another factor. Moving on, soil moisture prior to precipitation. I'm sure you've heard, especially as it relates to baskets, containers, whether or not they're large or even smaller ones, that if the soil gets really dry, that you should water it first before you fertilize it, let's say for some annual basket. And I think there's a lot to be said with that too, that you need to, in those situations, you need to maybe water it first and then put your fertilizer in it. Now, in the landscape, maybe you don't have the situation we just talked about. We have a lot of organic matter. Sometimes, if it's really dry for a really long period of time, and we're talking like a severe drought situation, the organic matter that is in that soil can become hydrophobic. And all that word means is the soil won't absorb the water. It just beads up and rolls off. And that may or may not be very noticeable, but there are some ways to avoid that problem, obviously keeping the soil from getting that dry. You may have experienced this if you've ever had a bag of potting soil, potting mix, especially some really cheap, bottom dollar soil mix, potting mix that you left out in your garage, and maybe it sat out there for a couple of years, and you decided to plant something up, and you put it in the pot, and you add the water, and the water just comes off, and it pushes all the soil out with it, and it didn't absorb any of it. It doesn't rehydrate, and the water won't get back into it. And so that's very, very dry organic matter. So the same thing can happen in the lawn, but there are some ways to avoid that as well. The intensity and duration of rainfall, again, it may be pouring down rain, but how much water are you actually getting during that event? And so keeping track of that can really help in your decision making on when to water your tree. Condition of the root system. So with that one, we're thinking about trees that, well, let's split it into two groups. So a newly planted tree, right? I've got a slide in just a little bit that talks about newly planted trees from containers and where the water needs to be placed for those, because when trees are young, they don't have a massive root system, right? And so you've got to put the water where the roots are. And it may not be exactly where you think it is. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But really the bigger issue here is, what if you have a mature tree that has had some sort of damage, some sort of underground utilities have been applied, or heavy equipment, machinery or something has been over that root system, and now you've got a compromised root system. It's going to take more water for that type of tree than it would for an otherwise healthy tree. And so those are another thing to consider. And then this last one, I kind of threw in here for fun. So this is the evapotranspiration rate, and you may be thinking, I don't even know what that means, and why does it even matter? So I wanted just to show you a resource that maybe you don't may not be aware that we have. But if you've not been to the UK Ag Weather Center, the address is there on your screen. There is so much information on this, and it's not just for farmers. It's there's stuff in here for home gardeners as well. And I would encourage you to go in and explore a little bit on this weather center. As far as I know, I don't know that many other universities have the robust information that all goes through their university as UK does. And we've had, if you haven't seen that episode, you can go back and watch Matt Dixon, who manages this website and is basically our UK weather guy. He puts all this information up. But anyway, to get to the cut to the chase here, you see at the top there's a little square that says Irrigation Manager. If you click on that, you'll get a screen where you can put in your county's name and a date, a range of dates, if you like, and calculate the evapotranspiration rate. So first of all, what is evapotranspiration? So evaporation is the first part of that. That's evaporation from the soil plus transpiration. So evapotranspiration. Transpiration is lost through the leaves. And that would be a very difficult thing for us to measure. However, it's been measured for us. And so I just pulled Casey County. What I did is went back and I looked at their weather maps of who had some moderate droughts this year. And I picked a time frame, I think I said 17-day period here. And what you would see is if you did this for your county, you would put in your first date. So I started with May the 21st. And I told it to calculate it all the way to June the 6th, because right after that, they had a rain event. But that's a 17-day period. The evapotranspiration rate, and you can see, and that's based on weather, it's based on other factors as well, but it was averaging about 0.18 of an inch. So what is 1800s? Am I saying that right? 0.18 inch of evapotranspiration loss. The second column here, or I should say third column, is the accumulative. So over those 17 days, your plant material lost 2.94 inches of water. Okay, so remember that. Now look at the precipitation over those days, a 0.26 of an inch, and that's it. So in this column, the cumulative precipitation adds all the way up to 0.26. So what's the deficit between 2.94 and what was replaced was 0.26. So we were 2.68 inches, that's Casey County, 2.68 inches below the norm for that county. Now that was a short period of time, and we typically tell people if it hasn't rained in a couple of weeks, so that's beyond that, then your tree is going to need water. But how much water does it really need? And so this is a way to go in and figure out how much water it actually needs. And I would say even maybe 10 days, maybe not even wait full 14 days to see if it's going to rain. It's so difficult to look at the forecast and have them say, oh, we got like a 60% chance of rain, coming up, so I'm not going to have to go out and water. It's going to be great. And then it doesn't happen. That's pretty frequent, right? They tend to miss that a lot. Or it does rain and it's not even measurable. It's 0.26 of an inch. It's not enough to make a big difference. And so on the chart below, you can see the evapotranspiration rate. And so on the hotter days, it was higher, and on cooler days, it was less. And then you can see the little rain event that popped up in the middle there. So that means we're below 2.68 inches of water in the soil for those plants. So what do we do with that information? And as we go forward, we'll kind of pull back to that. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. But before we get to that, I want to talk about some different types of trees. Okay, so new planted tree versus mature trees, and how that evapotranspiration rate could be used as a tool to help you figure out how much. So one thing that you know about new trees, especially if you're talking about, well, I think it would apply to bald and burlap too, but on trees that are in containers, all of the water that they get comes from irrigation, right? It's all irrigated in the landscape from the nursery. They don't get a drop of rain mostly except through that irrigation. And that happens daily and maybe even twice daily on really hot days. So all the roots are contained within that pot, within that container. Transplants then are not going to be able, once you put it in, this is a really nice hole and they've put their soil back in, which we recommend put in the exact same soil that came out of the hole. It looks like they've roughed up their root system. So everything looks good. They've done a good job of planting this. But transplants will not be able to take up moisture from outside of that root ball until those roots start to move out and away. So where does that mean we need to place water? We need to place it right up near the trunk into the root ball zone, right? And maybe slightly outside. But it's different than it is for mature trees. With a mature tree, you would never put water that close to the trunk of the tree, but that's where all the roots are right now. So that's where you have to start. And putting a lot of water out on the perimeter out to where you want the roots to grow is not necessarily going to be beneficial to the plant. It may in fact hold too much water, especially if you've made the mistake of adding a lot of organic matter into that. So using an organic mulch and then irrigating during the first season at 50% evapotranspiration. So what does that mean? Well, we saw that number earlier of I think it was 2.68 was our deficit. What they have found in certain studies is we don't necessarily have to replace 100% of that water. And they did it at different rates, 100, at 75, at 50, and at 25, and then of course nothing. And what they found was if we can replace 50% of the water that is short, then our plants will still thrive. So that's half of what's needed. So out of that 2.68, if we get an inch and a half of water during that time period, then you've not only saved your tree, but you've encouraged new growth. It's healthy. It's going to do great. And over the course of a summer for Kentucky, that usually averages out somewhere around 5 to 8 inches across the state as a whole. So that's kind of a broad stroke there, right? And if that comes from natural rainfall, then that's good. If it doesn't, and if you're watching this and you're from a state like that tends to be in drought all the time, in California being one of those, that's a lot of water to replace. And only having to put back 50% of the water can save a lot of money as well because you're not running your irrigation as long. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's how evapotranspiration can be used in that. But what if it's an established tree? So the first question then is, this tree's been here forever. It's weathered droughts before. It seems to be doing fine. Why should I even bother putting water around the tree, or should I put water around the tree? A study that was done on some oak trees a few years ago showed that on a severe drought situation, that trees that did get supplemental water this was over a course of, I think it was 5-year period, in a droughted area. Again, this was not in Kentucky. This was somewhere else where it doesn't get as much rainfall as we do. They were irrigated, and they saw over that 5-year period a 26% decline in the tree stand. There was multiple trees there, versus the same type of situation where no irrigation, where they had 73% loss of their trees. So the bottom line to that is, at least in oaks, it does matter. It can prevent their decline and their death. And sometimes that decline is a little hard to measure, but you start to see branches die back. You start to see trees that aren't doing as well. And unless they're side by side, it may not even be all that noticeable. But when you start having a lot of dieback in the tree, then that's a tree that's in decline. But if you're going to do that, the little diagram here shows us that we need to apply the water away from the tree root crown area, but within the tree rooting zone. And so in this picture, you can see, hopefully you can see my cursor there. We're talking about outside of this drip line, out into this root zone. So if you have a mature tree and you haven't had rain for several weeks, and you decide that it's worth the effort to put that, to get water, to get irrigation to that tree, putting it at the trunk of the tree is not the recommended location. It needs to go out into this root zone. And in fact, putting it at the trunk of the tree can actually be detrimental to the tree, as we'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so that's the difference in established and newly planted trees. What kind of problems can we get in if we don't irrigate correctly? Just like in turf grass, we don't recommend frequent shallow irrigation. Um, in turf grass, it makes your roots very shallow, and they can, if you miss something, something happens to your irrigation, you can lose good sections of yard because they don't have a deep root system. With trees, you can actually get more surface roots if you do irrigation that is just very shallow. You're just getting water in the top inch of the soil. That's not sufficient, and so you're going to get a lot of surface roots, and not what we want, right? And a less stable tree from that standpoint. If you're doing too much water, especially if it's a poorly drained site, that can make the soil anaerobic and actually pushes all the oxygen out of the soil. And even though it may be hard to think about, in the soil itself, it's made up of about 50% pore space, and some of that should have oxygen in there for the roots. They still have to be able to breathe. So overwatering is not good either. Irrigating at the base of trees, especially mature type trees, can cause fungal problems. We can get amarilla, which is a oak root fungus. We can get crown rot. And then, of course, too much water just leaches all the mineral elements. We usually don't have to fertilize trees very often. And maybe this is a good point to say, during a drought time, do not fertilize your trees or your shrubs. That's not when it needs it. Only fertilize healthy plants. But even so, the natural elements that are in the soil that the tree's feeding off of can get leached through the soil if we over irrigate. I don't think that's really going to be the big issue. I don't think that we tend to over irrigate our plants, but just to make sure it's said that we know. All right, so as far as types of irrigation, there's at least 3 major groups. This first one is called overhead irrigation. There's lots of ways to set this up. This might be just like a lawn irrigation system that you have, which works good for lawns, but doesn't work so great for our trees and for our shrubs, right? Typically, what a lawn needs and what a tree needs isn't always the same. And so if you have a tree in a lawn situation and it's getting that pop-up head squirting water toward it, it may not be the right amount. I'm sure it's probably going to be hitting the trunk of the tree, which we just talked about some of the negative parts to that. It's not very efficient way to water either. We get a lot of lost evaporation, and then if your soil's too hard or too compacted, some runoff gets off in your driveway and other locations. It has its place, but pointing it toward a flower bed with trees and shrubs in it probably isn't the right thing. If it was a new irrigation, you'd have thought, well, I'm going to add irrigation. It can actually cause problems to the root systems, which we also mentioned earlier can lead to more water needs of trees by cutting the roots, right? And as I said, trees are typically on a different cycle than turf and ornamental flower beds. They're going to need turf and ornamental is going to need water more frequently, right? Where trees won't need it as often. Still, it's better than nothing. If that's what you have, that can still be useful. It's just that there are some issues with that. Surface irrigation, and this one's probably our go-to. It's cheap, it's easy, it hasn't rained in a while. So we're going to grab a 5-gallon bucket or a watering can, and we're going to go out and water our trees. If this was a classroom, I'd ask you, is this person irrigating correctly? And hopefully you can see that this tree is not a mature tree, but a maturing tree, definitely not a newly planted tree. If this was a newly planted tree, then we can say, yes, we're watering near the trunk, we're watering where the existing root ball is. Here we're watering the trunk of a maturing tree. That's not helpful. We're inside the drip line. We need to be out into the yard. Still, it's a possibility. You could still use that. Your land, it works better if there's not a slope, if you don't have trees on slopes, if it's more of a level area. But so in other words, you have to watch out for soil erosion. It's not a very uniform way. It's hard to measure that. I mean, you're dumping water here, you're dumping water there. It's not evenly distributed underneath the tree. And on young trees, you have to watch out for flooding damage to the roots. So that's going back to that first picture of the newly planted tree, saturating all that loose soil where we want the roots to grow. If the roots haven't started growing out into that area, we could cause some flooding damage. And even, I don't know about necessarily in a drought situation, but I do know that's one of the reasons why we lose some trees in the landscape, is overwatering, especially for newly planted trees. All right, so if those two aren't the best, what's the best? Okay, well, this might be the best. This is drip irrigation. It's not perfect, and I'll start out with one of the problems with that is it still limits the root zone. You can't get it everywhere that it needs to go. The only way that you're going to get that is with a good rainfall, right? Which we don't have any control over that. But it is a better way to manage your water, putting it where it needs to go. It's okay on hillsides. So if you've got a sloping soil with trees on it, this is a better option than just dumping it on the surface. Because we're putting water typically in the same area, we can have some buildup of salts in the soil. It doesn't leach them out evenly. There is some initial expense, though it's pretty minor, especially compared to like irrigation systems being installed. Um, and you can have some other issues too. We got a couple of examples here. The first one is a tree gator. I don't know if you've ever bought one of those. I think they're around $20 to $30 online, but they're like a double lined bag basically, and they have two little emitters on the bottom, or maybe three. I think it's two. And you fill up the water, and this bag swells up, and then over the course of a few days, it drips that water into the soil. That's perfect for a newly planted tree to give it that water that it needs, because all the roots are right there at the trunk of the tree. That is ineffective for a tree that's been in the landscape for a few years. The cheapest option after that to water a tree would be something like this soaker hose. They're not that expensive. You can go around your tree in the drip line, just outside that drip line a few times, and turn that on. It takes a long time to saturate the soil through that, but it's another fairly good option. I will say, if you have squirrels, they will eventually find it and they will eventually chew a hole through it. But squirrels are a little neurotic anyway, and they chew holes through just about everything, I think. So animals can be an issue with soaker hoses. The other option would be something like a drip irrigation system. That can have pros and cons. Obviously, a little bit more expense, but you can get water where you need it. It like a bubbler or something near the drip line of a big tree can be very, very effective. But there's a little bit more to that, where these two could be done during a drought very quickly if you decide I've got to get some additional water on that tree. Okay, so we've talked about thinking about what type of conditions require us to get additional water into the soil to protect our trees and shrubs. And then we talked a little bit about the different types of tools that are available to water. So how do we maintain the water that's in the soil or that we're adding to the soil? And the number one answer for that is just mulch. And if you don't have mulch around the trees, consider getting mulch around the trees. It helps control weeds, which, if we think back to that first slide, vegetation is a competition, right? And that's whether that's your lawn or whether it's just weeds growing up around your trees. It controls weeds, and that helps. It also helps conserve the moisture. It's going to reduce the evaporation out of the soil, which, if we think back to those numbers, evapotranspiration numbers, that's helping to conserve moisture, so that's helpful. It also increases the infiltration rate into the soil. So the mulch grabs all the moisture, whether it's from rainfall or from you applying it, it holds it and it helps it to seep into the soil. It moderates soil temperatures. That can also be helpful for evapotranspiration, or evaporation at least, as it breaks down. So that's a good point there I want to make, is that what about using organic versus inorganic? So inorganic mulch would be something like lava rock or just pebbles or stone. That's attractive. That can help with weeds. It might even help conserve moisture some because of the protection level over the soil, so it's not exposed to the sunlight. But it's not adding organic matter. And we already know that organic matter in the soil can be very beneficial to holding the water holding capacity of the soil. So that's one reason why you might still consider organic matter, even though putting down rock is a mostly once and done job, and putting down mulch every couple years maybe is not. There's a lot of extra benefit from that. And then, of course, it also protects the tree from lawn equipment, which can be damaged. For example, exposed roots that get the top cut off of them. That's a damaged root. So there's a tree that has a greater water requirement than a tree that was protected from that. And of course, it just makes the landscape look better. And I should probably note, as we're about to wrap up here, How much mulch do you need to apply? The amount of about 1 to 4 inches deep is what we try to encourage. More is not better. Your benefit tops out at about 4 inches. I'm not going to go into all the details on mulching, like the mulch volcanoes and all of those types of things, but just keep in mind 1 to 4 inches deep. And then for every inch of the tree diameter at breast height, so like 3.5 feet off the ground, which for a small tree like that might be difficult to do, but for a bigger tree, for every inch diameter around the tree, then you want to go out a minimum of 2 feet from the tree. Now, if your tree is fairly small, that's not such a big mulch ring, right? I mean, it's maybe 6 feet around the tree. But the bigger that tree gets, that's a much larger mulch ring. And so you have to be practical also. Ideally, that would be the way to go. And I have seen some parks with massive, 70 foot tall trees, massive trunks, and a mulch layer that extends all the way out to the drip line. It's really pretty to see from above, but can you maintain that? I don't know. That they had a lot of foot traffic, and so that's another reason to do that. But wider is better. So increasing that mulch layer out as far as you can realistically do is helpful. What about soil amendments? Is it a good idea to add soil amendments? So one of the studies that I pulled for this showed that there was no, so if you have good loose soil, there was no benefit found from adding amendments at planting time. If your soil already perks well, if it's a decent soil, it has a little bit of organic matter in it, then you're okay. You don't really have to add anything. If you have a very compacted or a clay soil, then yes, they can be beneficial, but you can't isolate that or soil amendment, that organic matter, into a planting hole, because that's not helpful when you have a clay soil. It has to be over a large area. So ideally you would be thinking ahead, and you would decide, I'm going to plant a tree here and these shrubs and these flowers, and this is the way this bed's going to be. Then you would work up that entire bed and add maybe 2 inches of organic matter. So that might be composted manure, that might be bagged organic matter that you buy, or even some that you made yourself. And spreading that like compost, spreading that over that surface and then working that in, then you will see a benefit. You will see a tree that will do better and a shrub that will do better. All your plants will do better when it has that. But just putting it into the planting hole will not be a benefit. And in fact, will probably cause additional problems such as girdling roots, which can lead to the death of the tree, in roughly about 10 years, or maybe a little bit longer. And then kind of related to that study was that when they applied 2 gallons of water 3 times a week to a bed area that had soil amendments versus ones that didn't, that they resulted in faster growth over the soil amendments or even fertilizers. So just the take-home message of that last sentence, maybe that's not worded very well, is that the water is really what made the difference. I am very guilty about planting trees, giving them a drink at planting time and saying, live or die, buddy, you're on your own. And what this study shows is that that's, if you want it to live, if you want it to do well, if you want it to put on faster growth and become the tree that you bought it to be, 2 gallons of water 3 times a week in that initial planting period of about a year, maybe up to 2 years, made bigger difference for that plant than adding fertilizer or adding these soil amendments, which we just talked about. So let that be a take-home message for you. And speaking of take-home message, I got 3 things to close on. Your goal, again, is about 1 to 2 inches per week, which equates to about what we just saw, 2 gallons of water 3 times a week. Drip irrigation, if you're looking at how to water around those trees, drip irrigation is the most effective option. And mulch is the key to keeping the water where you want it to be.